Welcome to family cooking time with apple pie. Oh my! Today I'm going to show you how to make my favorite holiday apple pie. In your apple pie kit you will find 1 cup of flour plus a tablespoon of sugar, about a 1/4 cup of flour in an extra bag for sprinkling, 1 cup of sugar, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 6 large apples, make sure to wash them, 1 pie pan. From home, you're going to need 1 big mixing bowl, 1 stick of butter or margarine, 1 cup of ice, 1 cutting board, 1 cup measure. You could also use a bigger one, doesn't matter. 1 apple peeler, 1 big knife you're going to use to cut up your apples. If you're not comfortable with chef's knives, go ahead and use a smaller knife like this paring knife, that would be fine. A rolling pin and a pastry brush, but that's optional. The first thing we're going to do is make our pie crust, so make sure you wash your hands. We're going to start by taking our 1 cup of flour plus a tablespoon of sugar and adding it to our mixing bowl. That tablespoon of sugar is my secret ingredient, and it helps your pie crust brown a little better. Then we're going to take our 1 stick of butter. This should be right out of the fridge. This butter needs to be very, very cold. Go ahead and unwrap it and then toss it right into the flour. Then what we're going to do is just start ripping up that stick of butter into about pea-sized pieces. I find it a little bit easier to do bigger pieces and then tear those bigger pieces into smaller pieces, because you can see here that my pieces aren't exactly pea-sized. This is a great step where you could get your kids involved. Make sure they wash their hands first, and then they can rip the butter into small chunks. Just make sure you shuffle through the butter and the flour to make sure there aren't any giant golf ball sized pieces that they may have missed. If you've never made a pie crust before, don't stress too much about this part. It really doesn't matter. You can make them much smaller than pea sized. You can make them a little bit bigger like I do. It really doesn't matter. The most important thing is that your butter be cold. You really do need cold butter to make this pie crust, and the reason I do the big pieces to smaller pieces is it's easier to rip them that way. But you can see I can just go through, and as my pieces I just kind of shuffle them, look for bigger ones, rip them in half, and then I'm good to go. Once I'm done mixing in the butter, I'll wash my hands, then take my 1 cup measure, fill it with ice, and then fill it to the top with water. You're really going to need about a 1/4 cup of water, but it has to be ice water, so this is the best way to do it. And then I just pour a little bit at a time into a tiny well that I made in the center. I only make the well because I usually do this directly on the countertop and not with a bowl. It doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to take a spatula and just go ahead and give the whole thing, this is kind of a folding method. You really don't want to chop too much, not too much of a chopping motion. You want to get under and just fold in the water into the flour. What you're really trying to do is hydrate this mix until it becomes a dough without giving any extra gluten development by doing a lot of heavy stirring or a lot of, you don't really want the butter to be any smaller than it is already. And as you can see, I've added water just a couple more times. I added a couple tablespoons at a time, and you really only want to add enough water until this just starts to stick together into a dough. Smushing is the word I was looking for. You're not smushing the butter into the flour. You're just folding the water into the flour and trying to keep the butter pretty much in those pea-sized pieces. So once you've got it done, we're going to take a piece of plastic wrap. You don't have to use plastic wrap. You can use wax paper or parchment paper, just whatever you have on hand. And I just pour out all of my dough onto that piece of plastic wrap. Try and get as much of it off of the spatula here as I can. And then once it's all in your wrap or on your paper, just go ahead and kind of smush it into a solid ball. You can see the technique I used there. I just kind of smush it with the plastic wrap into kind of a square piece. Again, does not have to be perfect, but you do want to kind of keep it airtight because your pie dough will gray a little. And then I'm going to take my packet and put it directly in my refrigerator to chill. You want to chill it for at least an hour or two while you chop your apples. So this is my favorite trick. I learned it from watching Rachel Ray in the early 2000s, but this is what she calls her garbage bowl. So I take the grocery bag that I used, that the apples came in, and I just put it directly into my big mixing bowl, and then that is my garbage bowl while I peel my apples. So now we are going to take our peeler and peel all 6 of our apples. This might be another good chance to get your kids involved as long again as they have clean hands. All we have to do is peel all 6 of these apples. And you can see here that this is not a Granny Smith apple. I do not like using Granny Smith apples for my apple pies. I like to use, this is a Gala apple. I like to use red apples for apple pies, because I have a sweet tooth and I don't like the way Granny Smith apples taste. So I always use red apples or, these Gala Fuji kind of apples with my apple pies, just because I think they taste a little bit better, and then you don't have to add as much sugar to the apple pie filling in your mix. You just use the natural sweetness from the apples. That's my pie story, and I am sticking to it. That is the hill I will die on, and that's okay. I don't like Granny Smith apples. I only like Gala. So once you've got all of your apples peeled, go ahead and put that to the side. Then we are going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how I chop my apples for apple pie. You could use one of these apple cutter things, but I don't like them. I think they're unitaskers and they take up space in my drawer. I like to cut mine with a knife. This is how I learned how to do it in pastry school and at the bakery I worked at. So I take my chef's knife, and you're just going to cut directly through the core to cut your apple in half. That was perfect. You don't want to cut this way with the brown side on the cutting board. You want to cut with the flat side on the cutting board. And I'm going to cut each half apple in half again. So you can see I've got 4 quarters there. And then what I'm going to do is take my blade and cut into the apple at about a 45-degree angle. I'm cutting the core off of the apple, eat 1 quarter at a time. So you can see there how I made it through. There's all the nasty core stuff we don't want. And I just keep throwing the bits we're not using into the garbage bowl. So there's my little perfect blank apple bit. And I'm just going to do this again on each quarter. And if you miss a little, just go ahead and take another swipe. Be careful, of course, with your knife. Again, if you're not confident in your knife skills, first of all, this is a great way to practice, but you can also use a paring knife. You can see I pointed there really quickly to the bruised bit of that apple. If you wanted to cut it off and throw it into your garbage bowl, you could. It really doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to taste the bruising when it's in the apple pie filling, so I usually just leave it. So you can see here I have 1 perfectly peeled and cored apple. There's no nasty bits, there's no peel, and that's how I'm going to process each of my apples. So here we go. I'm just going to really quickly cut out the cores on the rest of my apples with the movie magic of super fast speed, so you don't have to watch me core 6 apples. And we're almost done. And there we go. Okay, so there's all of my apples peeled and cored. And at this point, I just take my garbage bag out of my garbage bowl and take it out and throw it in the garbage, because we're going to use that bowl to mix our apples, put our apple pieces into as we chop them. So I'm going to show you how I chop apples for pie. There are a lot of different ways to do this. The most important thing is that they are just all pretty much the same size pieces. So I chop each of those quarters in half, and then I very carefully, not very carefully, careful for my fingers, make about 1/4 inch slices across the apple. I think I described that correctly. So about 1/4 inch of a piece. You can see they're all kind of weird, bad triangles, but they are all going to be about the same size, and that's the most important thing. So I'm going to do that again very quickly with movie magic. cutting up all of these apples is a great way to practice your knife skills. Again, if you're not comfortable using a knife, a chef's knife, you can use a paring knife, but you can see here, if you can see very quickly, one of the reasons I like using the chef knife is you can use the blade to take the pieces and put them in the bowl. It's a little bit easier to use the big knife than it is to use the paring knife. And again, you're going to get a lot of practice cutting all of these apples, so it's a great time to try it if you've never tried it. The most important thing is to make all the apple pieces about the same size. You can see a little better here. I do about a 1/4 inch thickness. And I just go slowly and do it carefully, and you're not going to cut yourself that way. So once you get all of the apple pieces into your bowl, you can get your cutting board out of the way. And then we're going to go ahead and add our 1 cup of sugar. And on top of that, our 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. This is a great time to get your kids involved with clean hands and just have them toss the cinnamon and sugar into our bowl of apples. And you're just trying to coat everything evenly. As you mix it, as you try and get all of the apples coated, the cinnamon will naturally mix into the sugar. That's why we don't mix it ahead of time. Once I've got that all mixed in together, I will wash my hands and then go ahead and toss this into the refrigerator. Here I've got that smaller bag of flour for sprinkling, and it is time to sprinkle. So I'm just going to take a little handful of it, keep your palm facing up, and shake your hand back and forth. That's how I learned how to flour a surface in pastry school, and it's the best way to get a nice even distribution. I'm going to do just a little bit more here so that it's a little bit more centered in the screen for you. And there we go. And then what we're going to do is take your pie crust, go ahead and unwrap it. I put mine in the refrigerator and it wasn't quite enough time. It depends how long it's going to take you to chop all of your apples, but you want it to be very cold. The colder it is right now, the better, as long as it's not frozen solid. You should be able to roll it out unless it's been in the freezer for a couple hours. So as it gets sticky, just keep moving it. I like to pick mine up while it's smaller and just keep shifting it. That keeps the bottom from sticking. And then I just put more flour on the top. If your butter was smaller, you're not going to have as much of a sticking issue. I like to do bigger pieces of butter because it makes it a little bit more flaky, but a pie crust with smaller pieces of butter will of course work out just fine. Don't worry about it. And then you're just going to roll this out into about a circle-ish. You can see I very carefully here am checking that it's not sticking to the bottom. I like to pick mine up and readjust it, but you don't want it to stretch. So if you're not confident doing that, don't worry about it. Just keep rolling and make it a circle. There we go. I've got it about around. You want this bottom round to be bigger than your pie crust. And then what we're going to do, very gently, put the rolling pin on the bottom and then lift up the pie crust using the rolling pin. You wrap it around and you're just being really gentle. And then you lay on one corner of the pie pan and roll your pie crust out onto it. That's the easiest way to get a crust onto a pie pan. And then here you can see I had a little fold, so I'm just gently picking it up. And then you're just going to give the edges a little bit of a lift to make sure that the pie crust is touching the entire pie pan. You don't want any air bubbles in there. You don't want it to stretch when we pour the apples in. Don't worry about if you've got little smaller sides. If it's not perfectly even, it'll be fine. And then just put it to the side. So we're going to go ahead and grab our apples. You're going to look at this bowl of apples and be like, wow, that's way too many apples. Don't worry about it. Just add all of the apples. You can do your best. Just mound them right in the center of your pie pan. It's probably going to be taller than the edges of your pie pan, but that's okay. They're going to bake down. And you're going to cover it with a crust anyways, so it's not going to fall out. So you can see I take my fingers and I just kind of shape these into a nice little hill and make sure they all fit pretty much nicely in the pan. You could spend your time arranging the apples nicely, but it really doesn't matter because you're never going to see it. It gets covered by a pie crust. So it doesn't really matter how the apples are laid out, just make sure they all fit. So after I wash my hands, I sprinkle some more flour, and I'm going to roll this top half of the pie crust in exactly the same way that I rolled the bottom half, but this one doesn't have to be as big because you don't have to fit it into the corners of the pie pan. So just big enough to cover the top of your pie. And again, use more flour as you need it if it sticks to your pan. And I'm going to show you one more time. Gently put the rolling pan on top, grab the edge of your pie crust, and then roll it around the rolling pin. And that is how you are going to pick up your pie crust. And then again, just laying it so it's about center, just roll it right on top of your pie. So I'm going to take my fingers and go around and pinch the top and bottom together. If you have a spot where there's not as much crust, or there's like less crust on the bottom and more on the top, don't worry about it. Just pinch all the way around as best as you can. And then once we've got the whole thing pinched together, I am actually going to take my chef knife and just take a little bit after I rip this piece. This part here was a little bit thin on the crust. The bottom is a little bit weird, so I'm just going to put this little fixer piece on and then push it down, pinch it in just the same way. Take your chef's knife. You could also take scissors and do this part, and just cut away the excess. I like to leave like a centimeter hanging over the edge of the pie. I like a nice thick upper edge on my crust because I really like the way pie crust tastes. If you're not a big fan of the pie crust, you're really in it for the apples, you could just cut all the way around on the edge of the pie pan. But if you leave just a little bit extra like this, you can see kind of how I'm picking up the crust as it hangs down and then cutting it about a centimeter away from where the actual edge of the pan is. That's probably the best view of that, so you can see what I mean. After you do all that, what you're going to do is you can take this extra pie crust and throw it away or bake it into a small galette or something. What you're going to do is actually fold it up and towards the center of your pie crust. You can see I'm going to go all the way around and I'm just going to fold towards the center. And what that is going to do is when we actually go to like make the decorative edge on our pie crust, instead of getting this weird seam, we're going to get a nice smooth top to the edge of our crust. So you can see I'm going all the way around and folding it up and then pushing it down towards the center. And you can see here this weird part. That's why I added that extra bit of crust, so that it would be a little bit more even. And then here we go. You can see it looks kind of messy right now, but just trust me, it's going to be neat. And then once you've got it all folded over, what you do is take your hands and push it towards the center. So you're actually going to pick it up and lift it off of that edge of the pie crust, of the pie pan, excuse me. So take your hands and just lift and push towards the center. This is why it's really important for the pie crust to be cold. There's a couple reasons for that, but one is so that you can form the crust. So now you're going to take your two fingers and just pinch and twist. See? If you're not comfortable doing that, you can use your thumb as a cheater. Just put it in the crimp before and then crimp all the way around. Here we go. It's easier to just watch this technique than for me to describe it, but what you're doing is putting the thumb into the crimp ahead, the one you just finished, and then taking your right hand and just rotate it. Don't rotate your fingers, just rotate your whole hand, and you'll get a nice, pretty sort of fringe on the edge, upper edge of your pie crust. Okay, so now that the edge of our crust is done, everyone will be so amazed to see your nice crimped crust. Just take your knife, and I just do 4 little slits in the very top of my pie. It just vents it a little bit, so as the apples cook and it steams, you don't get a weird rip. And there is my apple pie. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this in the fridge. And you could keep it in the fridge for up to, I will sometimes make them the night before. But at least have it in the fridge for as long as it takes your oven to preheat. And we're going to preheat our oven to 450 degrees. While it's preheating, it needs to be in the refrigerator. You need that pie crust to be nice and cold. So this part is optional, you don't have to, but if you have a pastry brush, you can use, I'm just using some milk. The fattier milk you have, the better. And I'm just going to wash it a little bit. Be really gentle and take just a little bit of milk on the brush, and you're just brushing milk over the whole top of the pie crust. This is going to help it get a nice browner color. You could use milk, you could use half and half, would make it even browner. You could use an egg. I personally don't like an egg wash, but the milk will give it a nice golden brown color. If you don't have the milk or a pastry brush, do not worry about it. Your pie will taste great. It'll just be a little bit blonder. It's not going to get that golden brown, but it will still taste delicious and everyone will still be amazed. So don't worry about it. If you don't have a pastry brush, you don't have to do that part. So then I'm going to go ahead and cook my pie at 450 for 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to turn it down to 350 and cook it for 30 minutes. And then you will have a beautiful homemade apple pie. Your friends and family will be so impressed this holiday season eating your homemade apple pie. And when it cools completely, you can cut it just like I'm doing here, and it will be flaky and delicious, and you guys will just love it. I hope that this becomes a family tradition for you to make, and I would love to see all of your pies. Please, please use the hashtag #MadeAtPLD and show me your pies. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment on this video or any other social media avenue, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And I hope that you had a great time today. We will see you next time.